Well, hello everyone. I'm JasonPamental, and I'm going to talk to you about, among other things, a nifty little bit of font technology called variable fonts. If you've heard me open my mouth in the last 3 years, you've probably heard me say those words. I do tend to talk about them a lot, but the cool thing, at least to me, at this stage, is that it's different every time I give this talk. I've given some version of this talk probably 20 times this year, all over the world. And the thing that has been really remarkable is that every time I give this talk, I end up meeting somebody afterwards or seeing somebody else give another related talk during the event that completely changes some aspect of what I was thinking about or writing about or learning or playing with. And so it is kind of an evergreen sort of thing for me right now, which I really appreciate. And I hope that the combination of the type stuff and a bunch of other CSS techniques that I'm going to show you will, I think, fit nicely in where you're headed and what kinds of work that you're doing. So even if you aren't going to be working with variable fonts, I think there's probably still going to be some other stuff that you can do. So I'm, like I said, JasonPamental. I work with web fonts and helping companies implement web fonts better and improve their brand voice and also the performance of their websites. And in particular, looking at variable fonts as an extension of what they're doing. But really, the more important thing is that we have some really cute dogs, and I tend to follow them around a lot and post pictures on Instagram. So on the left there is Tristan, and on the right is Tilly. They are going to be back to help us explain some things about variable fonts in a little while. But they're kind of that's my thinking place. We walk in this field basically every morning, and I spend a lot of time either following them around or waiting for them to actually show up when I've gotten too far ahead. And just think about some of these challenges that we face in communicating, and how might we be able to do some of those things a little better. So, why is that important with what we do on the web? Well, because type is the voice of our words. It's the most prevalent aspect of design. It's one of the biggest impacts on performance, or the perceived performance, more importantly, what shows up on the screen when. And it's something that far too few of us have actual training in thinking about how that will impact that user experience. So I want to try and bring a little bit of that to this talk as well. This quote was really important to me earlier this year, only it still is now, but when it came across my Twitter stream back in March or so, it got me thinking about typography in a different way. Most of the work that I've done with typography and the writing that I've done, the book that I wrote, all this consulting and endless talks at conferences, has been about typography for reading, about reducing friction, making it easier for you to consume that content and understand what is trying to be got across by that product or the influence that they're trying to have on you. But there's another side to typography. There's the side of typography that wants your attention. Instead of getting rid of it, instead of disappearing, instead of helping getting the design out of the way, it's about bringing it forward and grabbing your attention and stopping you and making you think a little bit. So we're going to actually look at both sides of that and see some different techniques that might help us express a little bit more clearly and a little bit more forcefully with people and really help get a point across. So to catch you up a little bit on the things that I've been thinking about and writing about for the last 10 years, we're going to take a little primer on responsive typography as a whole. And what I mean by responsive typography is thinking about how is the proportion and scale working on a particular device. So the difference between body and heading is different, or it should be different, from small screen to large. So if you see this up on screen, it's sort of a typical heading and body copy kind of proportion. When that gets on a smaller screen, if we didn't make that smaller just now, you'd end up having the heading taking up the whole screen and you wouldn't really be able to read any of the rest of the content. So part of what we do is with our media queries and our responsive design overall, is we set a heading size and a body copy size, and then we change it as the viewport size changes. And then when we start thinking about having web fonts, and we start thinking about when those web fonts are going to show up, because it's going to take a little bit of time for them to download, we want to start thinking about the fallbacks. What happens when we get content on screen but the web fonts haven't loaded yet? So then we can add in something like a web font loader, in this case font face observer, that's going to bring a class into the page that will let us sort of scope some CSS. And you see down here in the corner, we've got the paragraph styles, but then we also have different styles for when the web fonts are inactive. So the web font loader is adding this class in, and it's allowing us to set specific styles that are not referencing the web font so that our content shows up faster. How many people are familiar with the term FOUT, or flash of unstyled text? It's been the biggest bane of adoption for web fonts since its inception, second only to when Apple decided to do flash of invisible text and not show you anything at all until the web fonts loaded, which is now unfortunately what all of the browsers have adopted. Thankfully, they've added a 3-second timeout, but think about the research that says in 3 seconds you're going to lose 50% of your audience if things aren't usable. So that's a pretty big gamble. You're waiting 3 seconds for web fonts. How vain are you as a designer to put the font above the content? We can't do that. So we want the content on screen. We have things like font display swap that is supported by most of the browsers now. That helps us trip the browser into the fallback font right away, but we still need to style that text so things don't reflow. So when we do correct them and the web font finally loads in, there's very little movement in that content. A lot of people don't even notice when that happens. So as long as you've adjusted the font size and the letter spacing and all that sort of thing with the content that's on the screen at the time, so think about getting the paragraphs pretty close, get the heading pretty close, get the nav pretty close. As long as things don't reflow, you're fine. Most people won't notice. Your whole objection to FOUT goes away. So we've done that kind of work. That stuff's been possible for us to do since about 2010. That's when the first web font loader was worked on with Adobe and the Google Fonts team. But now we can do more. Now we can do things and combine some techniques with variable fonts, with CSS custom properties and calculations to take this whole notion of how we scale our typography and make it work across all of these devices even better. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're coming back to the Odyssey mainly because I just think it's a really weird, long, strange trip that I've been on for the last 10 years with this. My wife will attest to the number of times she's had to pick me up at the airport this year alone. But more than that, I think the Odyssey of how we design and communicate has been really fascinating to see how that's evolved. So we start adding some things like, very simply, replace an explicit declaration of color with a CSS custom property. That allows us to change it a little bit more easily and maybe make it burgundy instead. And we can start to use these custom properties and specify them in one place. That makes it a lot easier for us to change them as we put that content somewhere else or change the context in which we're viewing it. And we'll look at that in a couple different ways later on. But that gets more interesting when we start to use those CSS custom properties, we're just going to call them variables, and combine it with things like calculations. So now we can start to do some things that get a little bit more interesting and allow us to use that sort of themability of adding this like separate list of variables that are evaluated at runtime and can be changed based on where things are in the layout. So we can do things like combine the heading size and the font size variables and then change it based on context. Or we can even do things like start to tie it into font weight and see what happens when we can change that around a little bit. So that's kind of interesting, and that's enabled by another bit of this new technology that we're going to talk about called variable fonts. And we'll come back to that again in a couple slides. But we can think about this in design systems too, meaning most of us are working with some kind of design system or that methodology where we are trying to make components in our markup, and we want to make sure that we don't have to rewrite the card every time we're placing it in the layout. If we move it over to the side, we want to be able to just update one or two things, and rather than rewrite any markup, we might have just altered one of those properties. And so the CSS custom properties, the variable, we can just reassign it when it's scoped in the sidebar. So we're writing less CSS, we're being more portable, and we're able to take that component and use it in more places. So coming back to variable fonts, I've mentioned it a bunch of times. I'm not sure how many people here have worked with them. Has anybody actually used variable fonts yet? Okay, awesome. This is my favorite kind of audience. So, what is it? If anybody's worked with fonts before, you're likely familiar with having to install a whole bunch of files. Every single weight, every variant, whether it's a width or italic, it's all a separate file. And when you're loading fonts on the web, that means lots of performance problems. So we start to constrain what we do. We use regular and bold and nothing else. And one of the things that is a problem there is that that's being passed off as good typography, to be consistent, to only use one weight here, one weight there. That's actually not good typography. It's the complete antithesis of it. That's just better for performance. So we've conflated these things, and we've started to kind of brainwash everybody, including designers as well, that they should only do this one thing. Where if you look at great magazine layouts, you might see 10. You might see 20. I talked to Roger Black about this, who was one of the original art directors for Rolling Stone, and he talked about layouts where he used over 30 different fonts and variants in a single cover design. And it was beautiful. Not all of us are that skilled, but it's a far cry from saying you should only use regular and bold. So, why is that important here? Because a variable font is all of that in a single file. And what you're seeing there are the outlines of the different widths and weights in that single character. This is all one font that's being manipulated with CSS along these axes of variation. So what are all these different axes? Well, Tristan and Tilly are going to help us out with that a little bit. So we have the standard things that you might expect, like width or weight. You might see a custom axis that would include X height. And then you have another one of the more standard axes of variation, slant. That's not it. We also have italics. And then the final, the fifth, so we have width, weight, slant, italic, and then the fifth one is optical size. So optical size is actually something that's been around for over 400 years. The notion of taking a smaller letter form, physically smaller, and cut it so that it's actually a thicker stroke at a physically smaller size. At the larger size, you can have finer detail that still holds up. A lot of this came about because it was a crude material and cheap paper. But the same thing holds true on a digital screen. When you have a really fine contrast at a small size, you might lose some of those strokes. So what you see here is text that has had the optical size forced to the lower value. And this is what it's supposed to look like. So see how the stroke contrast in the top lines is so much more refined? So much greater contrast between the two? But the smaller size didn't really change. So optical sizing is an axis. Go back. And go forward. So what it's doing there is it's adapting the presentation of the type itself based on the physical size at which it's rendered. And the beautiful thing about this is it actually is meant to work automatically. Font optical sizing defaults to auto. That's the one new property that was introduced. Now I'm going to pause for a second here and just give you a little bit more background on the format itself. It is an evolution of the OpenType specification, so it's the same font format that we've been using on desktop for years. It's just a new version of it. And these axes of variation are not distortions in the browser. It's only what the type designer included. So every font's going to be different. Some might have only weight, some might have only width. Some will quite often split italics into a separate file. There's a few reasons for that. Browser support is one of them. But by and large, this is something that you can now use in the OS, at the OS level in Windows and Mac, and it has been supported for over 2 years. It's supported in every shipping browser, apart from a couple of smaller Android ones. The only browser, the big outlier, is you can't use them in IE 11. However, what you can do is use app supports in your CSS. Supply a standard web font for older browsers, and then app supports replace the font family declarations with the variable font, and off you go. This is a perfectly safe production approach. It's actually in use in the system that I helped Lullabot design and build for the state of Georgia. It's deployed on over 40 sites right now and is in use by millions of people. So it is still a perfectly valid approach, even though you can't see it in every single browser. So, moving on to this whole notion of reducing friction. And I want to talk a little bit more about what that means. So in this case, we've got another couple of variable fonts. The top one is OK Sans from Jackson Kavanaugh at OK Type. And then this bottom one is Recursive. That was just released from Arrow Type with Google. They actually commissioned Stephen Nixon to work on that. And it's a really cool typeface we're going to look at again in a little bit later on the sample page. But this one actually has a number of different axes. And what we're going to show here is just adapting this from large screen to small. There's a few things that have happened. There's some subtle weight changes, some size changes, as well as the ascenders have actually tucked in that heading as it gets closer together. It's kind of subtle, but we'll show some other examples of how this is working. And one of the things that's driving it is this formula. So I'm going to come back here again and show this. Large screen, watch what happens as it gets smaller. It's not jumping down in steps. It's actually scaling pretty smoothly. That's because we're using custom properties, the CSS custom properties, the variables, along with calculations, and impacting the way we set the variable font itself. In prose, this is a little easier to understand. I will also note that while you can't read the links that are down here very well, the slides are already online, and all the resources are there. I've tweeted out a link to it already. I'll have it again on the last slide. All of this stuff is viewable later on. So the whole idea was written up first. The first way I experienced it was seeing Tim Brown, who's the head of typography at Typekit, write about this a couple years ago. He called this technique CSS locks. How many people have worked with viewport units? Okay, great. That's most of the room. So a viewport unit is 1/100th of the viewport, and many people have figured out that you can size type with that. So the type always scales with the size of the window. The problem is there's no min and no max. So it gets constantly smaller or constantly bigger, and you can very easily run into a scenario where your heading all of a sudden is smaller than your body copy, where it's just so big that it's just ungainly and it doesn't work with the design anymore. It also will not resize with page zoom because the viewport hasn't changed. So it's a huge accessibility fail. It completely breaks the way a user's expectation. But if you multiply it or add to it another kind of unit, an M or a pixel even, then it actually will. So you still get some of the benefits of that scaling, and that's what we're doing here. We have this big hairy formula going back, where we're working with whatever we set for a minimum size and a maximum size, and then breakpoints. And it's doing a bunch of crazy math, but it's coming up with something that will scale smoothly from here at the low end to here at the high end, and you still get that min and max. So I found that really useful to apply to both font size and line height, so that we can have a scaling typography that actually will work across all the components in our design system all across the site. So here's an example of applying all this in a larger layout, where we have all of these things on the screen here are being scaled in the same manner. But I also wanted to point out, this is something that I designed for Monotype last year for the launch of their first variable font, FF Meta. And everything that you see on this page, including got a little animation to kind of see how all of this stuff works in action. You can kind of see the weight axis moving along there. This is all done with a single file, 84K. So we're going to come back to some more specifics in a little bit, but the idea here is that you've got a single file instead of many, which will be much more efficient. And you get to that tipping point usually around 3 or 4 font files. So when you're looking at body copy especially, if you can replace the static fonts with a variable one, you can very often achieve a significant performance benefit before you've even gotten to the design possibilities. So even from a purely technical standpoint, if you look at what Nielsen Norman Group did last year, they swapped in source sans variable for the static instances purely because they were able to create a faster experience. Now that's a company that is entirely built around better user experience. That's the whole focus of all of their research. So if a company like that bet their farm and their homepage and the retention of their audience on this technology, you can be sure they did not do that without a serious amount of thought and testing. There's some other actually really good examples of the scale and performance capabilities, but I also wanted to show that this responds really nicely too. So all of these things scale smoothly across all these screen sizes. It does create some different design relationships, but that's okay. They're all interesting on their own. They don't have to be exactly the same. But I'm able to scale this whole experience, still make something that's meaningful, still call out the things that I want to call out, but all of these things have just scaled with math. I didn't have to set things at all these different breakpoints. That brings me to another aspect of this. When I mentioned that it doesn't have to look exactly the same, it's because I don't have that control. I can't control what you use to look at the website that I create. It could be any size device. You might get lazy and turn it sideways and lean it on your stomach while you're looking there, or you might hold it upright if you're standing in line at the bank. I don't know. So I don't know what the aspect ratio is. I don't know what the orientation of the device. I don't know what size it is. I don't have that control. I also don't have control over what mode you're using now. Kathy had her system set in dark mode last time, and a lot of people prefer that. So when we start to think about how we design, we need to think about more contexts in which it will be encountered. So when we think about a light mode and a dark mode, we have a media query to support that. So when somebody changes that preference, we actually have the ability to have the website react to this too with 2 lines of code. So if we're using these CSS variables, all we're doing is reassigning the text color and the background color inside that one media query. So I'm sorry, it's 4 lines of code, but you take my point, it's not really a whole lot of work. And I'm kind of cheating this with adding a class, but I can go over here and just use a little Apple script that I created, or I can't because it's in presentation mode. But we'll live on the edge a little bit. And so if I click on this, all this is going to do is trigger dark mode on my laptop. Wow, that was awesome. There we go. There. So all of these things are tied in to let the content meet the user where they are. I think this is really the important theme. And I think it's an important theme across this conference. Ellen gave a talk earlier about meeting the client where they are. You don't have control over that either. What's their preference for communication? If their preference for communication is reading content on a dark screen, I need to support that. So as a designer, I need to make sure that I'm keeping all of those things in mind, because this is not about this being a fad. This is between using something and not. If somebody has had a concussion and they have light sensitivity, if they're susceptible to migraines, these are all important considerations for how people can interact with that given website. If they've made an explicit choice to prefer content in that mode, why not support it? It's actually not that hard to do. We can also support users with low vision. Kathy's talk on accessibility during the last session had this amazing plugin, and I don't remember which one it was, but it was one that allowed you to visualize content with different visual acuity issues, and one of those was low vision. So we can use the same idea. In this case, it's using a grade axis on the text, which alters the weight without changing the physical space that the text occupies, and we're able to subtly increase that contrast. I'm going to go back and forth again and watch what happens with that text. It doesn't really change all that much, but the text gets a little darker, the background gets a little lighter, it gets a little bit heavier by altering the grade. And the other little typographic trick we did there is actually increase the letter spacing just a little bit, because as the letters get a little heavier, we want to spread them out just a little bit so they don't bleed together. Same thing holds true with dark mode. So it's not just about inverting things, but typographically we want to finesse it just a little bit. But again, we're giving them the control, but thinking about it ahead of time and finessing it just a little bit so that it gives them the best possible experience. We also want to allow people to change the size. I mean, there's one thing that we can do to read better when we're on a phone is use our elbow. We can bring the phone closer, we can move it further away. However, that's not always enough. I always have to take my glasses off. And so if I can just subtly increase the size of the text without having to resort to operating system changes, well, that's going to help me out on this site. I had another experience, though, because the next thing I'm going to show you was based on some research that I saw presented at a conference a few years ago from Kevin Larson at the Advanced Reading Group in Microsoft. And he was talking about research into a number of users that they had found that suffer from a particular condition called crowding. And this is usually a subset of people with some form of dyslexia. And what that does is it impacts the ability to actually take in content when things are too close together. And they found they could increase reading comprehension by 50% by increasing word spacing and line spacing. Well, there again, that's 2 lines of CSS, well-worn path, line height and word spacing, supported for years, a decade even, in every web browser, and we could do this. Well, this is kind of arbitrary. I just picked these numbers just to exaggerate it, but I had a really remarkable experience at a conference a few weeks ago. The day after I gave this talk, a young woman came up and just to say thank you, she appreciated the talk, that was great, and then she said something that totally blew me away. She said, I'm dyslexic. And when you got to that slide, all of a sudden I could read it. She didn't know she was suffering from this condition. She didn't know how easy it would be to make her life easier by writing 2 lines of CSS in the user style sheet. That was really powerful. What we do has impact on people's lives. Who are we to not consider these things? I mean, each one of these little techniques that I've been showing about light mode, about contrast, about font size, about spacing, individually takes about 2 minutes to put into your code base. Now, it takes a little bit more time to finesse it, but we could think about making that a system. We could think about putting it in a little panel that allows people to change it on their own. Give them the control to use the site in a way that suits them. We can use local storage to set a cookie. I actually have a demo on CodePen of doing this with light mode. Allow somebody to let the OS do it or set an explicit preference. It's really fairly trivial code to write. We can make this into a little panel that we can move from one project to the next. Use your CSS variables. It will inherit all of the styling that you need to make it match with your site. Make it modular. Make it reusable. Make people's lives easier. That's going to bring them back to your site more than almost anything else. Meet people where they are. So, because many of us work in agencies, and we don't want to have to reinvent these things all the time, I know a lot of what I've been talking about takes a lot of work. What makes things a lot easier is to turn it into a system. So if that same thing like this could also look something like this, simply by adding and changing a few variables, that's pretty powerful. Now we start to have a typography harness that we can move from one project to the next, only having to rewrite some of those core variables for font size and font stack. So I don't make these suggestions lightly. I've worked in agencies I've been working on the web for 25 years, and I know how important it is to be able to reuse your code. This is a path forward that has been really remarkable, and I've been able to use almost exactly the same code for almost 2 years on probably a dozen different projects of varying scales, from demos and workshops on up to the stuff in the state of Georgia. It works. It takes very little effort to move it from one project to the next, and it has a remarkable impact on the usefulness for the end user. So that's a lot about making it easier to read, and also making it easier for us to code. But what about going in the other direction? What about the things where we want to push design a little further? We want to stand out a little bit more from the other sites around us. Because what we found is that this has become kind of the standard of the day. It's the New York Times, it's Medium, it's any other major newspaper you can think of. It's fairly well set text in a standard column down the middle of the screen, lots of white space around it, big images. That's an improvement from the sites that we had 5 years ago, but it's now become kind of static. And when you look at great publication design, if you look at a magazine like Vanity Fair, and you really start to look at the articles there, there's no single article template. There's 6 or maybe 8. And we start looking at some of the variations that they have there, and we start to think about what is the analog in how we work. If we were using Pattern Lab, we're using Fractal, we're using Storybook, whatever it is, we come up with some kind of design system, and we made one layout and we stopped. We don't have to stop there. We could make more than one. So instead of it looking like this, with an extra few lines of CSS, maybe it might look like this. And this is set so that the image is going to scale first. It's just using a little bit of CSS math, again, to preserve the content width area first, let the image scale, and then it all moves down to a smaller screen size. Or, if we want to go a little further, why not explore writing mode? People are still going to figure out a title, even if it takes them a couple seconds longer to read it, and it might get their attention and increase the retention of their memory. That's been proven to be true. Sometimes if you slow somebody down and force them to change the way they read, that it helps them remember the thing that they just read. So again, this is adding about 50 lines of CSS. It could easily be worked into some kind of system and give you a switch in your CMS. I hear Drupal's good at that. And then you could actually build all this in from the start. And we've got a lot of interesting typographic techniques where we're styling the first paragraph differently or styling the first line of that paragraph. And these things are all really sustainable. They don't require any extra markup. They're all just part of what CSS supports. So targeting the first line is just a normal thing. But I wanted to push it a little bit further, because while that's interesting, it's not really breaking any new ground, really, except for maybe setting a title on its side. But I wanted to go even further. So started playing around with things like CSS shapes around a title. And when the title is set in a scaling unit, and the CSS shape is scaling the same way, we can actually have that still work and still wrap like that. This is the same HTML. There's one extra div in there. And again, another 50 lines or so of CSS. Again, that same thing maybe could look like this. And this one, maybe this is arguably pushing it a little bit too far, but still, I think you can kind of figure that out. It's just the title overlaid on one of the photos that I repurposed from further down in the article, so I didn't load an extra asset. It's just set in the background with a little CSS color filter over it. We're using CSS columns, targeting the initial, the first letter of the first paragraph, and allowing all of those things to move and scale really smoothly. So even on a small screen, we can still create an interesting experience without having to write custom code every time. The previous one was the only one that actually had custom code for that CSS shape. But I've been doing that in blog posts now for a few months. It takes me about 5 minutes to add that little chunk of CSS to a given blog post to adjust the shape. And all of a sudden I have a little bit more interesting layout. It's something that stands out a little bit more from the crowd. This is another example of a website. And actually I'm going to show you the live one, because thankfully I already loaded it in the browser. But this, so this is a company that I've been working with that works on a lot of large-scale government websites, but like many of us, doesn't have time to work on their own. So they asked me to help them out, and one of the things they wanted to be able to do was have certain types of blog posts stand out a little bit more. They wanted to be able to art direct just a little bit. So I started thinking about some of those ideas, and this is built in Jekyll, so it's a static site, but it's using a lot of the same principles as Pattern Lab. So it's built around a design system that lets them look at the standard site. And this is it's also completely built using variable fonts. So we've got Proxima Nova that has a width and weight axis up top. And then this one down here for the body copy is called Portada. That has a weight axis and optical size. So we're able to kind of fine tune it for a lead paragraph and then for the body copy down here. And by adding 3 lines of CSS and adding 1 class to the body during the publishing process, it can also produce results like this, where we have the CSS shape around there, the title is floated to the left, they can add their responsive images, and all of this stuff here, that weight and width is all with that same font. It's all Proxima Nova. Same one in the title, as it is in the navigation, as it is in the different levels of headings. So you can see it's little tweaks to width and weight all the way down. So that gives us a lot more flexibility to make something that's a little bit more interesting. And again, it also scales pretty nicely. So it goes back to a more standard layout as soon as the screen size gets small. But continuing that theme of trying to explore the reading experience and looking at that friction and ease, I think that looking at something in a normal format for longer form reading is okay, but I really wanted to explore how might we think about that longer form reading experience a little differently. Where is that middle ground between the web and a book, between an ebook and a sort of a more tailored experience on a tablet? So I started playing around with multi-column again and also CSS scroll snapping. These are all now supported in 3 major shipping browsers, and Edge, as soon as that tips over into Chrome full-time, I think that release is coming up in a month or 2. So it's a standard web page until you toggle that, and now we have something where it's that same thing in a swipeable experience without rewriting a single line of the HTML. And the CSS is taking care of bumping the media from one column to the next. We can have the floated stuff here. If I had spent a little bit more time on the demo, it actually could have been 2 columns on a wide enough screen. So it's all responsive because it's all based on viewport units for setting the width of the column. So it's a different way of thinking about how might we experience this content, especially when it comes to cross-device and cross-mode of interaction. It's still well-marked up, well-formed HTML. There's nothing interfering with it when we use this. We can also do things like use CSS to enumerate the paragraphs and create bookmarking. So that paragraph 37 in chapter 4 is the same marker in that text on any device, whether it's spoken or read. Doesn't matter, whatever the device size is. So it creates a way for us to move across modality and interact with content in a really interesting way that's different than we've ever been able to do before. And that's what I find so fascinating about this, is we're able to do almost all of the same typographic tricks that we do in print that we've been doing for hundreds of years, but we can also do more. We can react to context, we can react to light, we can react to the device or the mode of input and output, and we can do it all with the same source. So in a way, we've really kind of reinvented about what we think about typography and how it works, but just communication as a whole in a way that is really going beyond anything we've been able to do before. So that's really exciting to me. I think that there's a ton of possibilities. Many of these things are unlocked by having the variable fonts. Some of it is just the other CSS bits. But I did want to show you, here is the pattern lab, and this is the working one. So we can kind of play around with seeing that in production and see how things move and scale. That's kind of lame. But it's actually a little bit more interesting when you see it in a live Drupal site. So this is the same thing, but now in a live site, and they're able to build all of these content that's using Layout Builder. It's using the variable fonts and all of that other goodness that I was showing you in the scaling system, but now set up in something that has themable colors. The contrast is already built in, so all the color palettes are paired up with accessible text colors as well. And now it's in a system that, again, every site can be totally unique, but the typography is going to be readable and portable across all of them. Now, it's not just fans like me making stuff using variable fonts. It actually is getting the attention of some pretty big companies. IBM released Plex Sans earlier this year as a variable font, and they're working that into their Carbon design system. Monotype has also released, actually it's now up to 10 variable fonts, a lot of really core brand standards. So these are ones that are in heavy use across corporate America. I hear there's a really big health insurance company that uses Univer as their brand font. So there's definitely some interesting possibilities there. There's also a Fortune 10 healthcare company headquartered here in Rhode Island that has just commissioned a custom typeface that is also going to have a variable font. I don't know when that will actually see the light of day, but it is interesting to me that actually really big companies getting custom type work done are looking at this format seriously now as a way to increase their brand fidelity, be a little bit more true to that voice, be a little bit more expressive, and then get the performance win at the same time. Here's recursive again. So Google has started dipping their toe into the variable font water in a fairly significant way, and I wanted to show you some of the things that this one can do. So this is a single file. It's a little bit big. I think it's about 250K. However, it can be either a mono-spaced font or a proportional one. It has the axis, which is fairly understandable. So you've got that whole range. But it also has an expressiveness axis, which I think they've renamed, but still, it's kind of cool. It does allow you to really change the feel of the text. And when you start to combine those things, you get some really interesting things happening. This is also one of a couple typefaces I've seen that is separating the idea of italic from slant. So there's angle, and there is letter form. So I'm going to purposely turn the italic axis off, and so you can see what happens as you slant, but there's the difference in the characters. So there's the italic forms, which you could also use upright if you so chose. And we'll crank down our expressiveness. So it just makes the letter forms maybe a little bit different, but nothing too crazy. And then you can change the angle whenever you like. So all of those things come from loading a single asset. So imagine working on your own blog. You've got code samples, you've got monospace. You want comments, turn up the expressiveness. Use it as body copy, you have italic and slant as well as weight. That covers the whole range with that single asset. That gives you a huge typographic vocabulary without having to load in a whole bunch of different files. So it so happens that they're doing a lot more than just commissioning a couple of typefaces. What you're seeing here is actually served through the Google Fonts API. So this is loading 3 different variable fonts. Heptaslab is the one up top for the headings, and then I think it's Crimson Text is upright and italic with a weight axis that's being used for body copy. So all of that stuff is being served through the variable fonts, the new version of their API. It supports about 10 different variable fonts. I have a post on my site that actually gives you a little tutorial walkthrough so you can play around with that and see what all the fonts are that they offer. They've got a bunch more coming. They've also pulled a fast one on us. Who here has used Oswald on a website before? Anyone? Okay, yeah, we have a few. Because it's one of the top 5 web fonts that they use, that is served through Google Fonts. Well, 3-4 months ago, they just started serving it as a variable font for any website that was using enough weights to a client that could support it. And they didn't tell anyone, and they're doing it 148 million times a day. So if you're wondering about scale and performance in that kind of enterprise environment, there's your proof. There's no question but that this is a sustainable and deployable technology today that has very real-world benefits. I had another client actually reach out to me. It's an agency up in Halifax that's working with a really big sports broadcasting site. And they were asking me, would it be appropriate here? We took a look. They're serving 4 weights of one static font, 3 weights of another. Both are available as variable fonts. Without rewriting a line of CSS, we could go from 370K of font data to 100, 7 requests to 2. This is a site that has millions of users a month, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of page views. Start to do some math about the bandwidth savings there. That's far more than a $1,000 licensing cost. And that's not even how much this is going to cost. It turns out it's not going to cost them anything because they already have the whole range of them. But oftentimes, the cost is going to be offset very quickly by those kinds of savings. So it behooves us to actually look at the whole picture when we start thinking about this. But the benefits are very, very real. Now, one of the other things, and we're kind of getting down towards the end, I think, of my time. So I wanted to show you briefly something else that I've been able to work on as an invited expert on the W3C's Web Font Working Group. This is the next version of serving fonts. So this is where things are headed. And this is something that is tentatively called progressive font enrichment. And the idea is that we're essentially streaming fonts, but we're not throwing away the subset. All the different major font providers have been doing something like this for a few years. But essentially what they're doing is looking at the page that you've just requested, they're subsetting the font file and serving you that resource. And then when you go to another page, in many cases they have to serve you another subset. So it's fast, but it's throwaway. Adobe's done it a little bit differently, but the goal is to actually serve you a piece of that font and then serve you another piece on the next page and patch it together. And we actually have a working demo. So there's a link to this as well. This is something the Google Fonts team has made public. And when we take a look at this here, this is the demo. And we're going to clear this out. So we get rid of all of that. I'm going to go over to, again, Homer's Travel Blog. And we're going to grab some text. So I'm just grabbing 2 paragraphs of text in the title. I'm going to copy that, bring it over to our demo. And I've chosen Font Tools because I know that's a slightly more performant subsetter right now. This is just our research tool. We're creating a big test harness and a whole corpus of fonts that we're testing. But this gives us a quick view by selecting a variable font. In this case, we're going to go Comforta. And we'll go ahead and add this text. And what you see here, actually, let me start this again. Sorry. All right, we've got those 2 paragraphs of text. We add that. Here's what happened. If we served the whole font, it would be 33K. But to render the text that we put in, the third one down, incremental transfer, 11.2. So that's only 1/3 of the font data. Now, if it were a full variable font with extra axes and weights, it would be an even bigger difference in what we served. Now, watch what happens when we go over here and grab the rest of the entire first book of the Odyssey. This is a lot of text. So scrolling all the way down and grabbing this. And we'll go back and paste it into our demo. And we'll watch what happens. It only had to serve 4.7K of font data from what we had before to render about 10 to 15 times as much text. So that's going to happen every single page view on your website. And what's really fascinating about this is it's either going to be a smart font file or an Apache plugin of some kind. It's not going to require that you install anything new. It's just going to start to work, and it'll be supported by all the browsers. So let me come back over here and wrap up, because I know I'm kind of getting over time. These are some of the fonts that were used in this presentation, and there's the source for a lot of them there. But I put this up here because I wanted you to see the breadth of what is possible, and there are dozens and dozens more that are also available for sale or for use in open source platforms. And thank you very much. If there's one thing that you want to track, it's that link down there in the bottom. It's to the Notice platform where these slides are already posted, as well as all of the resources. I hope you'll check out some of the stuff on CodePen. Reach out to me on email or Twitter or anywhere else, and I am more than happy to point you in the right direction, give you feedback, get you started on stuff, or connect you with the type designer that's going to help get your brand up and running. Thanks, everyone.